trawling business, which he sold in 2007. He's currently a director of several seafood companies in Shetland, and also undertakes some international fisheries consultancy. When he's not working, John has been researching for his PhD, which he's undertaking on a part-time basis at the University of Aberdeen. And this paper that he's going to present to us today outlines some of the conclusions that are beginning to emerge from his research. And it even stopped thinking, that's good.
Thank you. So what do I do? Do I
press? You just press this little, yeah, that button here.
This one?
She says with confidence. It was working, there you go. Yeah, you just keep clicking through these to this one.
That one is that one?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
You want this one up?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, well thank you, Silke. What I'm going to talk about is my PhD, my research has been on a particular period of Shetland fishing history, the 19th century, and the cod fishery in particular. But what I want to do is to look at three particular aspects of that fishery which I think might interest this conference. I'm looking at the cultural and economic links between Shetland and the Nordic region during the 19th century. But before doing that, I'll give a little bit of background into the 19th century cod fishery. I grew up in a fishing village, and my grandmother came from Whiteness, which was one of the main centres of the cod fishery. And as a young boy going into her house, she always said to me, "You can only come Bain if there's been at Faroe." And Bain, of course, was the room which was kept as the best room in a Shetland house. And that's usually if the minister came along, or the laird came along, or somebody important came along, they were always taken Bain. So it always intrigued me that the Faroe fishermen were on the same social status as the minister and the laird. And as a little boy, so I often asked her questions about this Faroe fishing, and it sparked an interest which has been with me all my life. In the early 1980s, I was lucky enough to take a trip on the restored Faroese smack called the Westward Ho, and we sailed from Lerwick up to Faroe. That's in the days when I was much younger and had plenty of hair. And it was a wonderful trip, and during the 3 days we took to sail from Shetland up to Faroe, I began to imagine what it must have been to make that trip on a regular basis as a Shetland cod fisherman. A little bit of background about the fishery, why it's so important and what it is. The traditional fishery, which I think everybody's aware of, and a lot of that in this conference about the sixerines and the fourerines, and the open boats that fished with long lines on the seabed, and they primarily fished for ling. And these boats were out for perhaps 2 days at a time, would load up with a cargo of ling and some other species, take the fish ashore, the fish would be gutted, headed, split, salted, and then dried on the beaches. And that was the famous Shetland half fishery, which was very near inshore, and took place for a fairly small period of time, just 3 months during the summertime. In complete contrast was the smack fishery. These were decked, large vessels which fished with hand lines, caught primarily cod, and these cod were processed on board. These cod were gutted, headed, split, washed, and then salted. And these boats therefore stayed at sea for perhaps 10 to 12 weeks. And in complete contrast to the sixerines with 6 men on board, out for 2 days, the smacks typically had 12 or 14 men on each trip and would be at sea for perhaps 10 or 12 weeks. It began as a small inshore fishery, but rapidly developed into Shetland's only example of a distant water fishery. These boats from Shetland were fished Faroe, Iceland and Rockall. That was the fishing technique, 2 hooks on the end of a long line. It's a fishing technique which is known throughout Northern Europe. It will be familiar to Scandinavian visitors. It was also the same technique that was used by the Portuguese and Spanish fishing the Newfoundland Grand Banks. Unfortunately, there was no photography in the 19th century of the Shetland vessels fishing, but many of the Shetland smacks were subsequently sold to the Faroe Islands, and these vessels continued to fish using the same technique well into the 20th century. In fact, there were still some Faroese vessels using the same technique as late as 1958, fishing with hand lines. By this time, of course, the vessels had engines on board, had wheelhouses installed and so on. But this is a shot of a Faroese smack, fishing presumably on the Faroe Bank or of Iceland, and this would have been the same scene that would have existed on board the Shetland smack in the 19th century. This is another shot from a Faroese vessel. Obviously these were large boats, 70, 80 feet boats, fishing from April through to September, obviously experienced rough weather. This, I think, is a fascinating shot because not only it illustrates a rough day, the seas coming on board the deck of the vessel, but to me the most interesting thing is the fisherman on board this Faroese vessel is standing there very relaxed and doesn't even have his oilskins on. So clearly this wasn't an untypical day. He's standing there with his Gansey, with his jersey on. And of course the finished product was taken, the salt cod was taken and then landed in Shetland, where it was lay on the beaches, exposed to the sun and wind, and was turned into the dry, finished product. In some ways typical to the product of the six-ring fishery. And this product was then exported to primarily Spain. The fishing grounds began around Shetland, but by the 1840s and 1850s they expanded into three main areas: Rockall, Iceland, but most importantly of all, the Faroe Islands. Two areas, the Faroe Bank, and secondly the inshore area around the Faroes. There were at its peak about 80 of these smacks sailing from Shetland, and they became known, as I mentioned at the beginning of my lecture, as the Faroe smacks. It became known as the Faroe fishery, even though the vessels sometimes fished at Rockall and sometimes fished at Iceland. I want to now, given that very, very quick exposition as to what the fishery looked like, it began in the 1820s. It reached its peak in about 1860 and 1870 with it fishing in distant waters. It then began to decline in the 1880s, and its decline was very much caused by and was very much related to the huge expansion in the herring fishery in Shetland in the 1880s and 1890s. And as the herring fishery, as the herring boom took hold, and fishermen could make good money on a herring boat, not going away for a 10-week trip, going to sea on a daily basis during the summertime. Very, very difficult to get crews onto the Shetland smacks. They eventually crewed most of these boats using Faroese fishermen, but eventually the fishery petered out, and in 1908 the last Shetland smack sailed for the Faroese grounds, and after that it was no more. In many ways the technology transferred to the Faroe Islands. So that's a very quick exposition, quick summary of this very, very important fishery in Shetland's fishing history. What I want to look at now is three aspects of this fishery which I hope interests this audience. A kind of a cultural interchange between 19th century Shetland fishermen and the Nordic region, Faroe and Iceland, where they were fishing. First thing I want to look at three things. First of all, a particular fishing bank called Hagley's Bank. Secondly, the level of smuggling that took place between the Faroe Islands and Shetland. And then thirdly, to look at some aspects of language between Shetland and Faroese, Shetlandic and Faroese, and how far, if at all, could they understand each other. So first of all, when I was going into my grandmother's house as a small boy, growing up, she often told me this wonderful story about Hagley's Bank. And Hagley was a famous smack skipper from near Weasel. His name was John Johnson, And of course, if you had a name like John Johnson in 19th century Shetland, there would have been hundreds of John Johnsons. So he was known, as many Shetlanders were, by the name of his croft. And he came from a croft called Higley this time, which is quite near the Norseman's Inn in Weasel, if any of you know the place. And he was known as Higley. He was a very famous smack skipper. He skippered several vessels, and in 1889 he was skipper of a smack called the Clipper. And they would often fish up at Iceland on the last trip of the season. They did 3 trips in a season, starting in March, April and finishing in September. They always, for a variety of reasons, did their last trip in Iceland. And they fished up in the north-east part of Iceland, was where all the Shetlanders fished at. It was always this area. Occasionally there are accounts of fishing other areas, but it was always this north-east part of Iceland was the favourite fishing area. And I was always told this story that they were sheltering from a very, very bad storm along with a number of other Shetland smacks. And Captain Halcrow, in his fantastic book, The Sail Fishermen of Shetland, recounts this story, that they were sheltering in this bay in by Langanes, which was the main fishing area. Southwesterly wind, and this area was getting quite congested with about 20 Shetland smacks, and they were tacking and were trying to stay, keep moving. Some tried anchoring. There was too much weather to anchor. The anchors were dragging, and Higley, John Johnson, decided that he would hove to, and that, as I'm sure most of you are aware, is a nautical term for you switch the sails in the boat and you lie and the wind just takes you. And I was always told as a small boy that after several days of drifting, the wind abated, and he started fishing, and he discovered an area that they'd never fished in before. It was shallow ground, and within several days he got 20,000 cod on board. He'd effectively discovered a brand new fishing ground, and as he came back down past Langanes, he told the rest of the Shetland fleet, and they made way to this new ground and got bumper catches. And I was always told that this was Higley's Bank, and I always asked, well, where exactly was it? So when I started on this research, I looked at Halcrow's account. It's the only written account, and he says that the Clipper hove to, and after several days of drifting, he came upon this new fishing ground. Now, several to me has to be more than 2, because I think if it was 2, he would have said 2, and if it was more than 5, he would maybe say something more than several. So I thought several means between 3 and 5. And so the only thing that resembles a fishing ground is Thistlepjorden ground, which it must be Higley's Bank. But if I plotted 3 to 5 days on a vessel that was hove to, they went way beyond that, because a hove to vessel does about a knot, 1 sea mile per hour. And like many of these intriguing questions, I consulted books and I researched. But like many of these things, what you should do when you're stuck is ask a fisherman. So I asked Davy Smith from Scalloway. I was recounting that I just couldn't get this to fit in. Had Halcrow's several days been wrong? And he said, well, he would have been hove to, but he would also have had out a sea anchor. And a sea anchor was a mechanism that the smacks used, and many vessels used, to slow them down. It was a piece of sail or a piece of heavy wood, and it just lay in the sea, and it held the boat back. It wasn't anchored to the seabed, but it was a sea anchor. It was an anchor in the sea. And by using a combination of the hove-to rig and the sea anchor, that would have slowed down the movement of the vessel to about half a knot. And bingo, if you plot half a knot over several days, you come on to Thistlepjorden ground. So it looked as if this Thistlepjorden ground was Higley's Bank. Now, it appears as Thistlepjorden ground on Icelandic charts and on English charts. It never appeared as Higley's Bank, but the story had always gone in Shetland that there had been Faroese crew on board the Clipper when this bank was discovered. And all the other subsequent Shetland vessels that fished this ground would have had Faroese crew on board. And it was said that the Faroese always termed this area as Higley's Bank. So on one of my trips to Faroe, I decided to see if I could find out anything a little bit more about that. And I was told that one guy I should speak to was Morten Johannesson. Now Morten was one of the top Faroese trawl skippers. He's over 80 years old now. He still fishes with a small boat and sells his catch on the pier at Tórshavn. And he fished a lot in Iceland as a young man in the 60s and 70s. The Faroese can't fish in Iceland anymore since Iceland extended the 200-mile limits, but he was still fishing, he told me, in Iceland in 1974. So I showed him my chart of Thistlefiord Grund and Higley's Bank, and I asked if he knew this ground. Yes, he says, we fished there a lot, and they usually fished there, interestingly enough, in August and September, which was the same time as the Shetlanders were fishing there. And I says, what did you call it? Oh, he says, the Faroese always called it Higley Bank. And he says, I don't know, he says, it was never called that on the Faroese chart, on the Icelandic or English charts, but we always wrote on Higley Bank. He says, I think it's an old Faroese name or something. And so when I explained the origins of this name, he was absolutely astonished that for 100 years almost, the Faroese had been fishing an area of seabed to the northeast of Iceland called Higlebanken, which was called after a small croft in Weasel in Shetland. So he was quite astonished. And the Shetlanders, the Faroese know a lot about the Shetland smack fishery, but they obviously never knew the origins of Higlebanken. So that was very, very interesting. And I spoke to several Faroese skippers who all confirmed what Morten told me, that Higlebanken was indeed this area that was fished. So that piece of oral history will not be continued because the Faroese no longer fish northeast Iceland. The Icelanders call it Thistlefiord Grund, and so Higlebanken won't continue to be used because the people who still use that name no longer fish there. So on my first trip to the Faroes on board Westford in the early 1980s, that was a wonderful sailing trip. And I've been fortunate to have been in the Faroes many times on business and on holiday. And in 2008, I sailed with the Swan, which is Shetland's own restored vessel, which you'll see. I think, I'm not sure if she's in Lerwick or Scalway at the moment, but you may see in your trip on Saturday morning. She's not a smack, she's a herring boat. She's 100 years old, but rigged up with sails. So I went as crew on the Swan in 2008. Now I was beginning to think about writing this book and doing this research. So we spent a week around the Faroes, and we ended up on Suðuroy, the most southerly of the Faroese Islands. And we were due to leave for Shetland, and we went in. There's the old merchant house, the Thomson Merchant House, has been converted where they traded a lot in fishing, which we'll come on and talk about. But it's now converted into a cafe and a bar. So several of us went in and were having a coffee or a beer. It was probably a beer. And Anna Christian Thompson, who was the owner of Sawyer from Shetland, said, are any of you interested in having a look at our old books? And so we went to the next door room, and there was this room full of old ledgers, and she went and pulled one out, and there were the records of the Shetland smack skippers trading with the Thomson Merchant House in the 1860s and the 1870s. And just as I was beginning to absorb some of this fascinating information, our skipper, Magni Sinclair from Scalway, came shouting that he'd got a new forecast which wasn't looking so good, so we'd better leave right away. So we just had to leave. That was it. And I'd always promised that I would go back and have a look at the Thomson Merchant House and find out a little bit more about these archives. So I went back last year to do some research for the book, and after a few days in Tórshavn, I took the ferry to Suðuroy. Anna Christian Thompson was expecting me, and she had the archives already. But she'd said she'd arranged for a few old Suðuroy skippers, fishermen, to be there for me to speak to. And when I came there, there was this old Faroese fisherman who came out and shook my hand and said, in very, very poor Faroese, "Welkom hjem, Shetlander." And so he was saying to me, "Welcome home, Shetlander." And of course he wasn't meaning me. What he was meaning was that so many Shetlanders had come into Suðuroy last century, and so many Shetlanders had used this merchant house that it was like a second home. So I did some research there, and it was absolutely fascinating. Again, as part of the folklore about this fishery, was that when there was a high level of revenue tax on tobacco and alcohol in Shetland, so these were expensive commodities to buy. In the Faroes, for whatever reason, there was absolutely no tax, so it was like a modern duty-free warehouse. And you can imagine 60 Shetland smacks, away for 10 weeks, you've got a big cargo of salt fish to come back, and you can buy alcohol, mostly brandy, and tobacco at a fraction of the price that you could at home. There was a huge level of smuggling developed. Now and again, Shetland folklore is full of all the fantastic smuggling tales of the smacks coming back. They've got brandy and they've got tobacco on board. They're trying to avoid the customs officials. There was even a customs ship stationed here to try and eliminate the practice. And so I knew all of these stories, and I knew it was quite big. But I was absolutely astonished when I started to read some of these records. This is the Thompson Merchant House, so if any of you have the fortune to be in Suðuroy, go in. It's a lovely cafe and a fantastic archive next door. So this is the kind of example of what we were finding, and I could have picked any numbers of photographs to take. And I thought I would take one of my ancestors, William Goodlad from Burgh Isle, Shetland, and this was logged in the book. He's bought brandy to the tune of 18 shillings, and then he bought 3 ganses, 3 cherries for 15 shillings. And there's a sign of what he paid and what he then owed. And this was replicated many, many times. Now, 2 things came up to me, which absolutely astonished me. First of all, the average wage for a Faroe smack fisherman in the 1860s or 1870s would have been maybe £15 for 3 seasons. A skipper might have got £20, maybe £22. It was that kind of level. Some of the fishermen were buying brandy and tobacco to the tune of £20 to £25. Now, can you imagine taking your year's salary and buying contraband? So it was huge. It was absolutely huge. Far bigger than I expected. And secondly, the thing which absolutely astonished me was that most of these payments weren't made till the following season. So they got a year's credit from these merchants. So it was, the business opportunity was incredible. It was a no-brainer. You got enough brandy that you could sell throughout Shetland at presumably quite a big markup as well as your own consumption, and you didn't have to pay for it for the next year. So clearly it was more than domestic use. There was a very, very profitable sideline for many Shetland fishermen supplying brandy throughout the islands. High risk. Some Shetland cod fishermen spent time in jail as a result of this. And so I was astonished at the level of this trade, and the fact that there was this huge element of trust between the merchants and the fishermen. The merchants were clearly confident that the fishermen were coming back, and the level of goodwill, I think, that continues between the two communities of Faroe and Shetland. If there had been bad experience of merchants not being paid, I think that would have come out. So, fascinating piece of history of the links between Faroe and Shetland. Finally, and very, very quickly, language. In the latter days of the smack fishery, the many Faroese were employed on board Shetland smacks. And this led to a huge interest in the Faroe Islands in the whole smack fishery, and many of the smacks were sold to Shetland. And this, I don't read it terribly well, but this was a speech made by Johannes Patterson in Lerwick Town Hall in 1928. Johannes Patterson was one of the early campaigners for Home Rule in the Faroe Islands, and he comes from the farm of Kirkebroer, just outside Tórshavn, you would have been there. And it was a rather flowery speech, but you know, this is almost 100 years ago. But I put it in to illustrate the kind of depth of feeling there is in Faroe about this fishery. I assume Lerwick's Great and Good in 1928, whoever they happened to be at that time, heard this. And it was reported in the Shetland Times. But once again, Shetlanders and Faroe men joined hands, first some 60 or 70 years ago, when our common heritage, the great highway of the common Viking ancestors, the deep, rolling blue oceans that brings us our greatest material riches, but also takes, with ruthless hand, our finest manhood, brought your fishing fleets to our shores, and Shetlanders first taught deep-sea fishing in decked vessels to the Faroese. So it's a kind of a slightly emotional speech, but I think reflects the sense of gratitude which many Faroese feel that it was the Shetland cod fishermen that taught them to fish for cod. It was said in reading some of the literature and again the folklore that Shetland fishermen in the 1890s speaking Shetlandic, the very old Shetland dialect, were on board vessels along with Faroese fishermen who had no English, and they managed to understand each other. Now, I don't think for a minute that they would have been speaking mutually intelligible languages. Shetland dialect, even in the 19th century, was a long way away from the Shetland Norman. But it's interesting to observe that at the time that Jakob Jakobsen was doing his famous academic research in 19th century Shetland into the remnants of the Norman and the Shetland dialect, that here were several hundred Shetland fishermen speaking Shetlandic at that time, who were able, at least to some extent, to make themselves understood, the Faroese, and to some extent to understand what the Faroese were saying. So I could say more about some of these linguistic examples, and there are one or two fascinating stories in Faroe about Faroese families and Shetland families speaking to each other, or at least communicating to some extent. But anyhow, Silke had a sign up saying that time was very nearly up. So those are three very random aspects of the links between Shetland and the Nordic region, links which were forged, as Johannes Patterson has said, forged by the sea, and three links that came out of this remarkable distant water fishery which flourished in Shetland for about 80 years. Thank you.
That was fascinating. Again, thank you. John's such a good storyteller. Listen to him. Question?
Can I
Comment?
ask more?
Yes. Nordic Studies, one of the very first years that we ran master's courses.